I'm here at the Mathematical Institute at the University of Oxford talking with the authors of one of the first papers to be published in Royal Society Open Science. We're going to be talking a bit about their research and more generally their thoughts about open access and open data. So can you tell me a bit about your research and how it came about?
Okay, there's a fundamental problem which has been well known for years with cancer, that cancers outgrow their supply of nutrients and oxygen. There's a kind of supply and demand problem. So in the centre of large tumours, there's usually regions where the level of oxygen is heavily depleted. And this is important in medicine and biology because it means that these oxygen-poor hypoxic regions of the tumours don't react very well to chemotherapy or radiotherapy. So we know that these are a problem for treating patients. So what we were looking at is the mathematics of this sort of supply and demand problem, where you've got diffusion of oxygen into a tumour and then consumption of oxygen inside it. And there are various mathematical approaches for looking at this. And the particular question we were looking at was looking at some different mathematical forms describing the way oxygen is consumed. And there are some simple forms, which as physicists we quite like to use, but may not be very accurate. And there are some more accurate forms which we can look at with mathematics, but are more difficult to cope with. So in the work we looked at here, we wanted to see, depending on the mathematical assumptions we make about oxygen consumption in these tumours, under what circumstances are we going to get a different answer, and which one seems to correspond with the biology. So the paper was all about looking at under what circumstances do which models of oxygen consumption in these tumours hold and which ones don't. And I guess the useful take-home message we found from this is that for some of the simpler models, then there are quite large ranges of parameters or quite large regions where these still make very useful predictions, but we kind of know where they're safe and where we can use them and where they're not. So moving forward into predicting response of tumours to different sorts of treatment, which is what we're principally involved in my group, then we know which equations are safe to use under what circumstances and which are not.
I think what's interesting at this particular work is that we've known for a long time that the rate at which a tumour consumes oxygen has really big impact on what size it obtains and specifically where the region of low oxygens are concentrated. And for radiotherapy and chemotherapy, that has a big impact. So recently we've been doing work on trying to quantify these regions where they exist and what they should look like depending on their oxygen consumption rate. But there are a few different assumptions that are always made in these kind of models. All models have implicit assumptions. And in this one, there was a question of if you use a constant consumption rate, if you assume that your oxygen is being constantly consumed, versus whether you make a different, maybe more advanced assumption that its consumption rate is proportional to how much oxygen is there. Is there going to be a big difference? Now, what we did in this paper is we looked at the mathematical forms. We looked at both assumptions, said, well, here's one and here's the other. And we solved them and we looked at them. And what we found, which is reassuring, I suppose, is that there's not a major difference whether you use this particular, proportional form or the constant case. And that's nice because it makes the picture a lot simpler. If you can assume within first order estimate that constant consumption will describe everything, it makes the resultant mathematics much easier. And when those mathematics get a bit nicer, when you're trying to model it up and code it up for much more complicated geometries, it does make your life an awful lot easier. And that was one of our motivations for doing it as well. But also to answer the question, can we discriminate between these two models? Is there a big difference? And in this work, for most cases of parameter combinations, not really. And that's good, because that just means that it's safe to assume what we had, and a lot of other authors had been assuming up till now. But we just wanted to really look at and quantify that and see if we could firmly say, look, is that assumption justified or not? And the answer is probably, for most cases, yes.
So the paper looks at mathematical modelling and oncology. How do you bring together those two cross-disciplinary sciences?
I mean, within Oxford here, where my group is situated in the Department of Oncology, so all of the different aspects of cancer studies in medicine and biology and my own group in physics have been brought together, so we're in a single department. But that means that we need to collaborate out with other departments for specialist things. So we've got strong collaborations both with the physics department and here with the Maths Institute. And ourselves were in a slightly odd position of being a group of physicists who were working in an oncology department.
I think when you're a physicist, you look at things in the simplest possible terms and you try to simplify down. And that's always a good starting position for any kind of physical question that you're interested in. For example, here we wanted to see, well, what would happen in a tumour if the oxygen consumption rate obeyed a certain law or obeyed a different one? But the problem is sometimes you need a more advanced mathematical vocabulary, and instead of reinventing the wheel, we are very lucky to be able to collaborate with people like Alex, who when we come up with an idea and think we have it, something like that, he can actually look at it again through his training and say, well, you could approach it this way. And the idea in science is everything should eventually lead to the same answer no matter what approach you take. But it saves you an awful lot of time if you can get people with the requisite skills beforehand and consult with them so you're not constantly reinventing each other's work.
Yeah, so I'm based in the Wolfson Centre for Mathematical Biology here in the Mathematics Institute. So here we're very much interested in how mathematical modelling and also computational modelling can help elucidate or help gain insight into the mechanisms underlying biological processes. So for example, in the context of tumour growth, we're very interested in how processes at various different scales sort of all combine to give an overall rate of tumour growth or an overall efficiency of a certain type of therapy. And whilst it's very interesting mathematically, it's also important to speak very closely to experimentalists and to really ground this work in experimental data to ensure that it's genuinely scientifically useful.
So Royal Society Open Science is an open access journal and we require data to be made publicly available. How do you think that the open access and open data movement is going to improve science in the future?
Okay, so my group is funded by the CRUK and MRC Oxford Institute for Radiation Oncology, and my particular funding is from Cancer Research UK, and they've got a very strong message as a publicly funded charity that all of their research results should be in the public domain. In fact, we've got an obligation to make our publications open access. So we're very interested in publishing in this journal because it means the research results are then immediately available to the rest of the community. So I think that's very much in keeping with Cancer Research UK's mission, and the fact that, that our funding comes directly from the public, therefore our research results should be directly available to the public.
So Alex, as a mathematician, how do you feel that the open access and open data movement is affecting your research?
To me, a particularly important aspect of the open science and the open data movement is the provision of all the numerical and computational code that's used to generate the results in a paper. So increasingly computational models are becoming very, very complex, and so reproducibility and repeatability are kind of increasingly important things to worry about. So perhaps David and I write a paper and we generate a computational model and we simulate it. How much trust should the reader place in the results of our simulations? Well, if we provide all the code that we use to generate those simulations, then hopefully that will allow the reader to be able to satisfy themselves that what we've portrayed is correct. And it would also hopefully help the next iteration of science where anyone else can kind of build on that code. So I think that's for me a particularly important aspect of kind of open science.
It goes for experimental results in a big way as well. You have experiments from years ago that people have done, and if you want to check the veracity of them, you have to replicate the experiment. If the original data is available for people to look through and to apply new analysis to and look at, I think that makes it a lot more powerful. I recently came across a paper from 30 years ago, and the original author did a series of amazing experiments and has lost all the data. And I think in this day and age that shouldn't happen, and I think the open data movement and the open science movement in general is moving us towards a place where all this will be stored in a repository, and if you want to look at someone's results with a new set of eyes and a fresh vision, you can do that. And that is, I can only see it being beneficial for science and for people's trust in science, which I think is another important issue as well. People can trust things that they can see themselves, including other scientists, and that's positive.